Adolf Hitler's hatred for the Jews wasn't a sudden outburst of rage. It was something that grew slowly over decades, shaped by deep historical prejudices, distorted ideologies, personal failures, and political ambition. To understand this hatred is not to excuse it, but to recognize how dangerous ideas can evolve, spread, and destroy when left unchecked. Antisemitism, the hatred and prejudice against Jews, has existed in Europe for over 1,000 years. In the Middle Ages, Jews were often blamed for everything from plagues to famines. They were accused of poisoning wells, of kidnapping Christian children for ritual sacrifice, of being agents of the devil. They were forced into ghettos, banned from owning land, and denied most professions. Because Christians were forbidden from charging interest on loans, Jews were pushed into moneylending, which in turn made them targets of resentment, especially when debts went unpaid. This religious-based anti-Semitism persisted for centuries. But something changed in the 19th century. With the rise of so-called scientific racism, Jews were no longer seen simply as a religious group, but as a separate and inferior race. This wasn't about faith anymore. It was about blood. In 1879, a German political writer named Wilhelm Marr coined the term antisemitism, not as a critique of Jewish religion, but of Jewish biology. He argued that Jews were inherently corrupt, genetically wired to subvert and weaken society from within. This dangerous ideology was popularized by pamphlets, newspapers, and public speeches, especially in the German-speaking world. By the late 1800s, ideas like eugenics and social Darwinism, the belief that some races were naturally superior to others, were gaining ground. Pseudoscientific thinkers argued that Jews were a parasitic race, bent on destroying the so-called Aryan people from within, through financial manipulation, intermarriage, and cultural influence. These ideas were completely false, but they provided a convenient scapegoat for economic and social anxieties. It was in this world that Adolf Hitler came of age. Between 1908 and 1913, he lived in Vienna, then the capital of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He was a failed art student, sleeping in shelters and scraping by with small change. Vienna was a city of contradictions. Culturally rich, but politically toxic. The mayor at the time, Karl Lueger, was an open anti-Semit who used hateful rhetoric to win elections. Hitler admired him deeply, not just for his ideas, but for his ability to manipulate public anger. During this time, Hitler immersed himself in nationalist and anti-Semitic literature. He read publications that blamed Jews for capitalism, socialism, moral decay, and Germany's decline. Vienna didn't invent Hitler's hatred, but it fertilized it. He began to view Jews not as individuals, but as a collective enemy, a race that had infiltrated every level of society and needed to be removed. When World War I broke out in 1914, Hitler enlisted in the German army. He served as a messenger on the front lines and was wounded twice. He received the Iron Cross for bravery. But when Germany surrendered in 1918, he was devastated. He had believed Germany would win. The defeat felt like betrayal, and many Germans felt the same way. This bitterness gave rise to the stab-in-the-back myth, a conspiracy theory that claimed Germany hadn't lost the war on the battlefield, but had been betrayed by Jews, Marxists, and pacifists back home. There was no evidence for this. In fact, many Jews had fought and died for Germany in the war. But truth didn't matter. The myth was emotionally powerful. It turned confusion into hatred. It gave Hitler someone to blame. After the war, Germany was in chaos. The Weimar Republic, Germany's fragile new democracy, was born into hyperinflation, political extremism, and social unrest. In 1923, $1 was worth 4.2 trillion German marks. People were burning currency for heat because it was worth less than firewood. Jobs vanished, banks collapsed, starvation loomed. In these conditions, extremism thrives. People looked for answers, and Hitler gave them one. He formed the Nazi Party, and quickly became known for his fiery speeches, blaming Jews for both capitalism and communism, for Germany's defeat, and for its humiliation. This contradiction didn't matter. What mattered was fear, and Hitler exploited it brilliantly. That same year, he attempted a failed coup, the Beer Hall Putsch, and was sentenced to prison. During his time behind bars, he wrote Mein Kampf, a blueprint of everything to come. In its pages, he wrote of Jews as a race tuberculosis of the peoples, accusing them of poisoning German blood and plotting world domination. He laid out his vision of a racially pure Germany, one without Jews. He didn't hide his plans, he printed them. When Hitler became Chancellor in 1933, he began turning these ideas into law. Within months, Jews were banned from civil service, from teaching, from working in media, and from owning businesses. In 1935, the Nuremberg laws were passed, stripping Jews of citizenship and banning it. Jewishness was defined by ancestry, not religion or self-identity. Even people who had converted to Christianity decades earlier were still considered Jewish by law. Then came Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, in November 1938. Across Germany and Austria, Jewish synagogues were burned to the ground. Jewish shops were looted. Thousands of Jews were arrested and sent to concentration camps. It was no longer just legal discrimination. It was state-sponsored violence. But the worst was yet to come. When World War II began in 1939, Hitler's vision for Europe expanded. With the invasion of Poland and later the Soviet Union, Germany gained control of millions of Jews in occupied territories. At first, the Nazis forced them into ghettos, like the Warsaw Ghetto, where starvation and disease killed thousands. Then came the Einsatzgruppen, mobile death squads, that followed the German army and executed Jews in mass shootings, often in forests or ravines. But even this was seen as inefficient. In January 1942, high-ranking Nazi officials gathered at a villa in Berlin for the Wannsee Conference. There, they formalized what they called the final solution to the Jewish question. It was chillingly bureaucratic. The plan was simple: to systematically exterminate every Jew in Europe, from Poland to France, from Greece to Norway. Industrial murder was introduced. Jews were deported in cattle cars to death camps, like Auschwitz, Treblinka. At these camps, they were stripped, shaved, and gassed. Their bodies burned in crematoria. Over 6 million Jews were murdered in the Holocaust. Entire families, children, mothers, the elderly vanished. This wasn't an act of spontaneous madness. It was a calculated genocide, organized by educated men in suits and executed with chilling precision. What drove Hitler's hatred? The answer is layered. His antisemitism was shaped by centuries of Christian prejudice, by pseudoscientific racism, by the trauma of war, by personal humiliation, and by his own lust for power. He needed an enemy to unite the people, to blame for Germany's collapse, and to justify his quest for control. But Hitler did not act alone. His hatred found fertile ground because millions accepted it, or ignored it, or feared resisting it. Hatred does not need everyone to believe. It only needs enough people to stay silent. This is the terrifying legacy of Adolf Hitler, that with enough lies, enough fear, and enough power, even the unthinkable becomes possible. That is why we must remember not to dwell on the darkness, but to shine a light on how darkness grows. Because hatred, if left unchecked, does not stop at words. It marshes, it legislates, and eventually it kills.